Okay, today we're going to be graphing tangent. Tangent is in the form y equals a times b theta. And tangent's a lot different than sine and cosine. The period is pi over b. And here that would be pi over 1. And our asymptotes are x is equal to pi plus or minus pi over 2b. So here that's pi over 2. The reason we have asymptotes for tangent graphs is if you look at the unit circle, this point is 1, 0, this point is 0, 1, this point is negative 1, 0, and this point is 0, negative 1. The reason we have asymptotes is because tangent is sine over cosine. So if we divide 1 by 0, it's going to be undefined at pi over 2. So that's why we have asymptotes. So we will have pi over 2 here, negative pi over 2. And we can go ahead and draw those asymptotes. Okay, so halfway between 0 and pi over 2, which would be pi over 4, there's a point that uses a, which here's 1, so that would be a 1, negative 1. So a point right here at pi over 4, 1, and at negative pi over 4, negative 1. So our graph is going to look like this. At tangent, now this graph, just like sine and cosine, we only graph, we've only been graphing from 0 to 2 pi. Tangent, it's not about graphing from a certain 0 to 2 pi because it just keeps on going on, but so does the sine and cosine. We could do another cycle. So you can see the period is pi because negative pi halves, so that's half a pi here, half a pi. So from one asymptote to the other asymptote, that's 1 full pi. So if we wanted to graph another one, we would have to go another pi this way and negative pi this way. So pi over 2 plus pi would just be pi over 2 plus 2 pi over 2, which is 3 pi over 2. So we would have another asymptote over here at (3 pi over 2). And right here at negative 3 pi over 2. And we could just sketch another graph here right in the middle. Right in the middle there. The most important thing for me, it's really not a lot involved in graphing tangent. The most important thing for you to know is to know how to find the period and to know how to find the asymptotes, okay? So looking at number 1 here, our period is 2 pi over b. I'm sorry, just pi over b. So that would be pi over here. Our b is 2. And our asymptotes are x equals plus or minus pi over 2b. And here, since b is 2, that's pi over 4. I'm only going to make you guys graph one cycle. So just put a 1 here, negative 1 here. Right here we would have pi over 4, negative pi over 4. Let me try that again, negative pi over 4. And those are your asymptotes. Okay. So there's a point halfway here, halfway here. Just really want you guys to just be able to sketch this and see that the period is half a pi because a fourth of pi plus a fourth pi would be half pi. So in number 2, the period is pi over b. So here it's pi over b is 1, so it's pi over 1, which is just pi. And our our vertical asymptotes are x equals plus or minus pi over 2b, which would just be pi over 2. So we can say one's here at pi over 2, right here at negative pi over 2. And since our a value is negative, that just means that instead of our graph going this way, it's going to go the opposite way. Forgot to draw my asymptotes. Okay, so it would just look like this. They're going to get closer and closer to those asymptotes, but never actually touch the asymptotes. Okay, on number 3, the period is pi over b. So here that's pi over. B is 1/2 here, so that's pi over 1/2, which is actually equal to pi times the reciprocal of 1/2, which is 2 over 1. So our period is 2 pi. And our vertical asymptotes are x equals plus or minus pi over 2 times b. And 2 times 1/2 is just 1, so our asymptotes are just pi. So we have pi here, negative pi here. Okay. Halfway. Okay, and it's going to be the same for all of those for tangent. Okay, so I guess I can do one more really fast. Our period here is pi over b, which is pi over 4, and our asymptotes is x equals plus or minus pi over 2b, and here b is 4, so that's pi over 8. So we'll just have pi over 8 here, negative pi over 8. 5, negative 5. And we can just sketch our graph halfway. Okay, so let's look on the back. Okay, on the back, this is just a review of graphing sine and cosine. So remember that when graphing cosine, the amplitude is just your a. So here our amplitude would be 1. And our period is 2 pi over b, so that would be 2 pi over 4, which is pi halves. So the period is different for sine and cosine. It's the same, but it's different with tangent. And then we're graphing 4 cycles. So this would be 1, this would be negative 1. And remember that if we're graphing 4 cycles and each cycle has 4 parts, then to determine how many we're going to break our x-axis up into, we would just divide, or we would multiply 4 times the number of cycles, and 4 times 4 is 16. So we're going to divide this into 16. So I've divided into 1, 2, 3, 4 cycles, and then we would divide those into 4s. And then we would just start labeling our x-axis. Now, to determine what we're counting by, or the scale of our x-axis, we're going to have to take our period, which is pi halves, and divide it by 4. So that would be pi halves times the reciprocal of 4, which would be 1/4, so that's pi eighths. So this would be 1 pi over 8, 2 pi over 8, which is pi over 4, 3 pi over 8, and you would continue on all the way to 2 pi. Remember that cosine starts on the y-axis. Okay, and then we can just sketch it. It's like connecting the dots. Okay, and sine is the same, except for remember sine starts in the middle. Here our sine amplitude is -1. The period is 2 pi over b. So here that's 2 pi divided by b, and b is 1/2. So our period would be 4 pi. This is only half a cycle. Remember, sine looks like this, right? So we're only doing half of that. So it would look like this, but since it's negative, we're going to go the opposite way. This would be 2 pi, this would be pi, and we would just sketch half of that cycle. It's only breaking it into 2.2 parts because we're only graphing half of a cycle, and a cycle has 4 parts, so that's why we would only graph 2. Tangent, we did that earlier. Okay, so here we're writing the equation. Remember that the period is equal to 2 pi over b. So to find b, we can cross multiply here, and that gives us 2 pi b is equal to 6 pi. If we divide both sides by 2 pi, we will get b equals 3. So the equation here is y is equal to a times sine of b theta, and that would be y equals 8 times the sine of 3 theta. Okay, you would do the same exact thing here for cosine, set the period equal to 2 pi over b. Okay, for tangent, remember that the period for tangent isn't 2 pi over b, it's just pi over b. So we can set this equal to pi over b, and then we can cross multiply and get pi b equals 2 pi. And then we can divide both sides by pi to get b equals 2. So for tangent, it would be y is equal to a, which is -1, times the tangent of b, which is 2 theta. Okay, the next thing on number 17 and 18, what we're doing here is we're writing the equation given the graph. So in order for us to write the equation, we know that this is cosine, and we know it's cosine because it's starting on the y-axis and not at the origin. Okay, so for cosine, we need to know what A is, which is our amplitude, and we can see it's 1. And we need to know what B is, and B is the period. B is how far, or the horizontal distance it takes to complete one cycle. If we start here, go down, and end here, that's one cycle. So from 0 to 2 pi. So B here is 2 pi. I mean, B is not 2 pi, sorry, the period is 2 pi. And if the period is 2 pi, then we would set that equal to 2 pi over b, because we want to find b. Okay, so if we cross multiply here, that gives us 2 pi b equals 2 pi, so b is equal to 1, which means this equation is y is equal to a, which is 1, times the cosine of b, which is 1 theta. Okay, if you look at number 18, this is also cosine because it also starts on our y-axis. And we know that a is negative, and it's actually -2. You can see it's -2. And the next thing we need to find is the period. The period is equal to, so we'd start here, we go around, and we complete one full cycle right here at pi. So our period is pi. Now to find b, we have to set pi equal to the period formula, which is 2 pi over b. And then we would put a 1 under pi and cross multiply. That gives us 2 pi is equal to pi b. So we divide both sides by pi, and we get b is equal to 2. So our equation is y is equal to a, which is -2, times the cosine of 2 theta. Okay, for your homework tonight, I would like for you guys to do number 9, 10, and then 12, 14, 15, and 16, okay? So 9, 10, 12, 14, 15 and 16. I'll also post a study guide today in case you guys want to start reviewing. Remember, your quiz on this is on Wednesday.